Something really unusual is going on in the world of global finance, a world that's normally pretty predictable. The most powerful financial players on the planet, we're talking central banks, are making a move we haven't seen in over 50 years, and it involves thousands and thousands of physical gold. The real question is, why are they doing it now?
To really get a sense of the scale here, just look at the price. In 2025, gold has been on an absolute tear, recently blowing past $4,600 an ounce. But look, this isn't just another new high. It's the 50th record it has set this year alone. A 66% surge in 1 year? That's not just a rally. That is a massive signal that something has changed.
But the price? That's really only half the story. The real engine behind all this is this number right here. For the third year in a row, the world's central banks have scooped up over 1,000 tons of gold. Now, to put that into perspective, before 2022, they were averaging maybe 400 tons a year. So what we're seeing isn't a trend, it's a complete fundamental shift in strategy.
And that, right there, is the core mystery we're diving into. These aren't hedge funds making risky bets. These are the most cautious, long-term thinkers in the financial world. So when they make a move this big, this coordinated, and for this long, you have to ask yourself, what do they see coming that maybe the rest of us don't? Okay, so to really understand why this is happening, we first have to talk about the system they seem to be moving away from. For the better part of a century, global finance is played by one simple rule: the US dollar is king. This setup had a name, the exorbitant privilege, and the deal was pretty straightforward. The world needed dollars for trade, so their central banks would park their savings in US government debt, treasury bonds. For decades, these were considered the safest asset on planet Earth, and this created this huge, almost bottomless appetite for US debt, which, in turn, allowed America to spend way more than it brought.
Well, that whole arrangement is now unwinding, and fast. Just look at this. At its peak back in 2014, foreign countries held over 40% of all U.S. debt. Today, that has plunged to below 15%. They aren't just slowing down their buying, they are actively getting rid of what they own. That decades-long privilege is literally evaporating before our eyes.
Now, for central bankers who think in terms of decades, not quarters, all of this has a very unsettling ring to it. Because the last time the world started to lose faith in the dollar's promise, the entire global financial system completely fell apart.
Here's a quick recap of how it all went down. Back in the 1960s, the U.S. was printing a ton of money to pay for wars and social programs. Well, other countries, especially France, they got nervous. They started showing up and asking for their gold back in exchange for their dollars, which was their right under the rules. By 1971, the U.S. was losing gold so fast that President Nixon had to go on TV and slam the gold window shut, basically ending the deal overnight.
What followed was a whole decade of financial chaos, inflation, and pain. But the really shocking long-term result was this. Once the dollar was officially cut loose from gold, it started a steady, relentless decline. In fact, it's lost over 98% of its buying power since that day. And you can bet the people running central banks today have not forgotten that lesson. All right, so we've seen what's happening, and we've seen that it's happened before. So now let's get to the real heart of the matter. Why are they doing this? Our research points to 3 really clear, overlapping reasons that explain this modern gold rush. Let's just walk through them one by one. First, there's the growing risk of sanctions. Second, you have the cold, hard math of government debt. And third, we're seeing the rise of a new multipolar world that is actively searching for a dollar alternative.
The first driver is pretty simple. It's just self-preservation. In 2022, Western nations froze $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. Now, setting the politics of that aside, it sent a massive shockwave through the global financial community. It proved that reserves held in another country's currency aren't really yours. They're a liability, a promise that can be broken. Gold, on the other hand, physically sitting in your own vault, that has zero counterparty risk. Nobody can freeze it with a keystroke.
The second reason is just plain arithmetic. The U.S. national debt is north of $38 trillion, but the number that's really making people nervous is the interest payment alone. At $1.2 trillion in 2025, the U.S. is now spending more just to service its debt than it spends on its entire defense budget. Central bankers look at a chart like this, and they know that throughout history there's usually only one way out of a debt trap this big. You devalue your currency by printing more.
And that brings us to the third big driver. The geopolitical map is changing. For decades, there was no real alternative to the dollar. It was the only game in town. But now, countries like China, Russia, India, and Brazil,
the BRICS nations. They are actively building alternatives. They're striking trade deals in their own currencies, and they're creating new payment systems that bypass the West entirely. And in this new system, gold is seen as the perfect neutral asset to settle accounts.
So this isn't just one or two countries going off on their own. Now, this strategic pivot away from paper money and towards hard assets is a truly global movement, and it involves a whole new cast of characters.
I mean, just take a look at this list. Of course, you've got America's geopolitical rivals, like China and Russia. But you also have NATO allies like Poland and the Czech Republic. You have major financial hubs like Singapore. The buying is so widespread, it's crossing all political and geographical lines. And that tells you the motivation here is less about politics and more about financial prudence.
And this brings us to what has to be the biggest irony in this whole story. The one major institution that's sitting on the sidelines of this historic gold rush is the central bank of the very country that issues the world's reserve currency. It seems like everyone is getting ready for a shift away from the dollar, except for the Federal Reserve itself.
And the irony just gets deeper. The U.S. actually owns the largest gold reserve in the world, over 8,000 tons of it. But on its official balance sheet, it's valued at a completely absurd $42 an ounce, a price set back in 1973. At today's market price, that gold is actually worth over $750 billion. But for some reason, we still pretend it's just a historical footnote.
So, what's the final verdict here? When you boil it all down, what is the fundamental choice these central banks are making? Well, it's not a short-term investment. It's a long-term strategic bet on the very future of what money is.
This table really says it all. Fiat currencies, like the dollar or the euro, are basically IOUs. They are liabilities, backed by government promises. They can be created out of thin air, and their value depends completely on you trusting that government. Gold is the exact opposite. It's nobody's liability. Its supply is finite, created by nature, not by printers. And its value requires zero trust in any politician or bank. It just is. And this, right here, is the most crucial point to understand. These central banks are deliberately choosing an asset that pays them nothing. Gold has no yield, over government bonds that do. They're making a conscious decision that in the world that's coming, preserving their wealth is going to be far more important than earning a return on it. They are choosing safety over returns.
Which leaves us with one last massive question to think about. This whole global system of ours, running on pure paper currencies with no backing, it's really only been an experiment for about 50 years. That's a blink of an eye in the long history of money. So are the actions of the world's most powerful, most informed financial institutions telling us that the results of that experiment are finally in and that they are quietly but urgently preparing for a return to the one asset that has been money for 5,000 years?